Night had already settled when the trucks rolled into the small Midwestern town in the autumn of 1943. Their engines coughed and rumbled through the quiet fields, carrying a dozen men who had once marched across Europe under the black flags of the Reich, shackled not by chains but by exhaustion. The German prisoners sat in silence, each imagining the humiliation to come. Some clenched their jaws, expecting to be paraded through the streets as trophies. Others braced for the sting of spit and curses, convinced their captors would waste no kindness on defeated enemies. The gates of the makeshift camp opened with a screech. Lanterns flickered, illuminating a space more reminiscent of a rural fairground than a prison. The men stumbled down, boots crunching on gravel, their uniforms tattered, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They whispered to one another in clipped German, their breath visible in the cool night air. A few spat bitter words, swearing never to bow their heads before an American. Yet, as they shuffled forward, a peculiar smell drifted across the yard bread, fresh and warm. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Bread was not part of the punishment they had imagined. They were led toward a low building, its windows glowing with an amber warmth. Inside, long wooden tables were set with bowls and ladles. An American farmer and his wife, faces lined with years of work, moved between the benches, placing loaves of bread on the boards. Soldiers stood watch, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, yet their expressions were calm, almost indifferent. One guard motioned to a chair. His voice was neither mocking nor cruel. He said, simply, "Welcome, sit down and eat." The words hit harder than a rifle butt, a paradox so sharp it pierced through every defense the prisoners had built. They had prepared themselves for scorn, but not for hospitality, for hunger, but not for supper. A silence fell heavy over the room as each German stood frozen, uncertain whether to obey or recoil. The scraping of a chair on the floor broke the spell. One man, pale and weary, lowered himself hesitantly. Soon another followed, then another, until the whole group sat stiffly at the table, hands twitching above the bowls. For a moment, no one dared to touch the food. The soup steamed, fragrant with vegetables and meat. The bread crust crackled as the farmer's wife tore it open and placed it in front of them. It was not a feast, but to men who had crossed the Atlantic expecting starvation, it might as well have been somewhere in the corner. An American sergeant leaned against the wall, watching quietly. His gaze carried no triumph, only a weary patience. And so, on their very first night in captivity, German soldiers met a reality that defied every lesson drilled into them. They had expected hatred and curses. Instead, they were treated as men. That invitation, sit down and eat, was more than an order. It was a fracture in the wall of propaganda, the first whisper that the world was not as simple as they had been told. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it in your part of the world right now? The year was 1943, and the war had reached a fevered pitch across the Atlantic. Allied forces had landed in North Africa and Italy, while the Eastern Front devoured divisions by the week. Yet in the United States, another front quietly opened, far from gunfire and tanks, the arrival of German prisoners of war. By the end of the conflict, over 371,000 German POWs would be housed in America, scattered across more than 500 camps in towns like Aliceville, Alabama, and Hereford, Texas. Their presence became part of the local landscape, as ordinary Americans went about their lives alongside men who, months earlier, had been sworn to kill them. The camps themselves were paradoxes in wood and wire. Guard towers rose above neat rows of barracks, but beyond the fences stretched vast farmland and sleepy towns. Many were placed deliberately in rural areas, where the labor of captured soldiers could ease the shortage of farmhands. For locals, the sight of prisoners working the fields was jarring. These were supposed to be the face of a ruthless enemy. Yet here they were, hoeing rows of cotton, carrying water buckets, or even fixing fences under the watchful eyes of American guards. At first, suspicion lingered heavy in the air. Families had lost sons in North Africa, in Sicily, in the skies over Europe. Newspapers printed casualty lists every week. In such an atmosphere, the idea of giving decent food, shelter, and even dignity to enemy soldiers felt like an insult to many grieving households. Rumors circulated in towns that the prisoners were being fed better than U.S. civilians under rationing. Mothers who had buried sons asked why German soldiers deserved warm bread when their own boys had died with nothing in their stomachs but dust and adrenaline. Yet the Geneva Convention bound the United States to humane treatment, and Washington saw more than legal obligation in it. There was strategy, too. How America treated its prisoners would echo across the world, shaping not just Germany's view of the war, but its future after surrender. Behind every dinner served and every coat distributed lay a calculation to defeat an ideology not only on the battlefield, but in the human heart. In this broader setting, small details grew heavy with meaning. An Alabama farmer recalled seeing POWs marvel at the abundance of food in camp kitchens, piles of potatoes, sacks of flour, barrels of beans. For men used to shortages at home, such plenty in the land of their enemy was unthinkable. A guard remembered the way one prisoner stared at the electric lights strung around the compound, muttering that even Berlin had gone dark during blackouts. These glimpses, fleeting but undeniable, chipped away at the myths that had carried them into war. The paradox deepened a nation scarred by war, with mothers weeping and ration books thinning, still extended a hand of civility. It was not forgiveness, nor friendship. It was something quieter, harder to explain, a kind of moral stubbornness, insisting that humanity not be surrendered, even against those who had tried to strip it away. And so, as the months unfolded, the camps became mirrors. In them, Germans confronted not only their captors, but their own expectations. Every loaf of bread, every glimpse of American abundance, whispered a dangerous idea. Perhaps the world they had been told to hate was not the world as it truly was. Morning broke with the sound of train whistles and the hum of machinery, for the German prisoners transported deeper into the United States. The journey soon revealed a sight that shook their faith in everything they had been told about American weakness. Rolling past miles of steel and brick, the camps near Detroit and Michigan exposed them to the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. Here stood the factories that never slept, their smokestacks piercing the horizon, their floors alive with endless conveyor belts. At Willow Run, the Ford Motor Company had transformed farmland into a sprawling complex the size of a small city. Under floodlights, riveters and welders worked shifts that ran around the clock. The rhythm was relentless, metallic clangs echoing like war drums in reverse every 63 minutes. A B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line, one aircraft every hour of the day, every day of the week. German prisoners stared in disbelief, realizing that in the time it took them to eat breakfast, America had built another warplane. By the end of the war, Willow Run alone had produced over 600 bombers, more than Germany could muster in entire campaigns. The contrast was bitter. Some prisoners whispered about their homes in Hamburg or Munich, where ration lines stretched for blocks and bomb shelters rattled nightly. Others muttered angrily that the Reich had promised supremacy in engineering. Yet here in enemy territory, machines poured out with a speed that dwarfed their most ambitious boasts. One man scribbled in his diary, later confiscated by guards, "If this is what their factories achieve in peace, then we have already lost the war." The factories also exposed the POWs to another paradox, the workers themselves. Many were women in overalls, their hair tied up in scarves, drilling and welding with precision. Some were African-American laborers, moving shoulder to shoulder with white colleagues, their laughter and banter cutting through the clamor. For soldiers raised on Nazi racial dogma, the sight was as disturbing as it was disorienting. A Luftwaffe mechanic, once proud of his craft, fell silent watching a black worker operate a massive press, his efficiency unquestionable, his authority respected by those around him. The prisoner's silence spoke louder than protest. For the Americans, allowing prisoners to witness this spectacle was no accident. Military intelligence knew that the sheer scale of production would carry more weight than pamphlets or propaganda. A single hour inside a Detroit factory was more devastating to Nazi pride than weeks of lectures. The message was simple: while Germany starved, America built. While the Reich shouted, America worked. When the prisoners were marched back to camp, the clatter of the factory stayed with them. Like an echo, they could not escape. Some walked in silence, others argued, but none could deny the truth of what they had seen. It was not just bombs that threatened their homeland, it was this unstoppable rhythm of steel and fire, powered by a nation that treated abundance as ordinary by nightfall. The barracks buzzed with murmurs. A few clung stubbornly to faith in Hitler's secret weapons, muttering about V-2 rockets and wonder planes. But others lay awake, haunted by the relentless image of conveyor belts and bombers, realizing that in this new war, belief alone could not fill the skies. The barracks smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, a reminder that winter had crept into the camp. Yet, alongside the ordinary routines of confinement, came moments that the prisoners never expected. These moments did not arrive with speeches or grand gestures, but in small, disarming encounters that gnawed at their convictions. One afternoon, as prisoners unloaded sacks of grain for a local farm, an elderly black man who worked alongside them lit a cigarette and casually passed the pack toward the nearest German. The gesture was simple, almost careless, but it froze the young soldier in his tracks. He had been told his entire life that men like this were less than human, fit only for servitude, yet here in America. The man offered him a cigarette like an equal. Without hesitation, the German accepted with trembling fingers, muttering thanks under his breath. He later wrote in his diary that the moment unsettled him more than captivity itself. Children also became unexpected teachers in some towns. Local boys and girls would gather outside the wire fences, staring wide-eyed at the men in gray uniforms. At first they mocked them, mimicking goose steps and salutes, but soon curiosity outweighed scorn. They began trading smiles, tossing pebbles, or asking questions through the fence in broken German. One prisoner sketched a picture of a bird in the dirt for a little girl, who laughed and clapped her hands, to men hardened by war. Such innocence chipped away at the wall of hatred more effectively than any lecture. And then there were the nurses. A small infirmary inside the camp tended not only to American guards, but also to the prisoners themselves. When frostbite struck a young soldier's feet, an American nurse knelt to wrap them with practiced hands. He flinched, whispering that he was the enemy. She simply said, "Not tonight," and continued her work. The room grew so quiet that even the crackle of the oil lamp seemed loud. That night, the prisoner told his bunkmates he had never been more ashamed of believing the lies he had once carried into battle. Not all prisoners were ready to yield to such experiences. Some scowled and muttered that kindness was a trick, a softening tactic before harsher measures. They refused to eat meals with enthusiasm, shoving bread away in defiance. Yet their resistance looked brittle against the quiet persistence of ordinary humanity. Every cigarette shared, every child's laughter, every bandaged wound pressed harder against the myth of the enemy for the Americans. These acts were not planned campaigns. They were instinctive, the natural gestures of a people who refused to abandon their values even in war. But for the Germans, they carried the weight of revelation. To be offered a cigarette, to be treated with dignity, to be healed instead of beaten, these were contradictions too sharp to ignore. When lights went out across the camp that night, some prisoners lay awake, staring at the rafters, for the first time. The silence was not filled with fear of tomorrow, but with questions. If their enemies treated them this way, what else had they been wrong about? The darkness pressed heavy, not with despair, but with the uneasy dawn of doubt. By early 1944, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm. Work assignments filled the day, meals came with steady regularity, and nights were spent in long barrack rooms where whispers traveled faster than the cold. Yet within those wooden walls, another kind of battle was fought, a battle of the mind. And its weapons were not rifles, but diaries, letters, and quiet doubts. Guards sometimes intercepted notebooks and scraps of paper smuggled between bunks. In them, fragments of thoughts emerged, raw and unfiltered. A Wehrmacht corporal scrawled late one night, "We are fed 3 meals daily. Roast beef yesterday, beans today. How can it be that prisoners of war eat better than our families in Cologne?" His words betrayed not only disbelief, but guilt. A Luftwaffe pilot wrote to his fiancée back home, "They hand us coats against the cold. They even allow us to sing. I wonder, my love, if the Reich fears such kindness more than bombs." The whispers spread. Some men confessed they had never tasted so much milk or sugar, luxuries that had vanished from German markets long ago. Others marveled that even guards complained openly about politics without fear of arrest. The simple act of watching Americans argue about the president or the war effort unsettled them deeply. In Germany, such conversations risked prison or worse. Here, they were casual, tossed about like idle gossip. Of course, not all prisoners accepted these impressions. Around the barracks stove, debates flared. One sergeant insisted that it was all a show, a staged theater to weaken their resolve before interrogation. Another spat that Americans wanted them soft, so they would carry tales of false comfort back home. But these arguments rang hollow against the evidence piling up daily hot soup, open talk, and a dignity preserved even in defeat. One evening, during supper, a young prisoner broke down and wept into his bowl. His bunkmates hushed him quickly, fearful that guards would misinterpret his tears, but the guards simply looked on, neither mocking nor punishing. The man sobbed that his own brother, fighting in Stalingrad, had likely died starving, while he, a captive, ate from an enemy's pot. His grief silenced the room. It is here that I turn to you, watching this story unfold. If you were in his place, torn between loyalty to a collapsing Reich and the undeniable evidence of humanity from your captors, what would you believe? Would you cling to the iron promises of propaganda, or let them melt away with the taste of warm bread? The diaries kept piling up, each a thread unraveling the fabric of old convictions. By winter's end, many men no longer looked at their captors with hatred. They looked at them with something more dangerous to the Reich: curiosity, and perhaps reluctant admiration. The barracks were never truly quiet. Even after lights were extinguished and the guards' boots crunched away into the night, the air remained alive with murmurs, quarrels, and restless dreams. Inside those cramped wooden walls, men wrestled not with chains but with themselves. Some clung stubbornly to the old creed. A former SS officer barked that America's kindness was nothing but poison, a trick to soften their will before crushing Germany outright. He lectured by the stove, his voice sharp, his eyes still burning with conviction. A handful of younger men nodded along, eager for certainty in the fog of defeat. But across the room, others rolled their eyes, tired of speeches that rang hollow against the reality of bread, soup, and freedom to speak. Arguments flared into the night. One side hissed about honor, betrayal, and the Führer's promises of victory. The other countered with what they had seen with their own eyes, workers of every color standing side by side in factories, farmers who treated them with civility, guards who did not bark orders but asked politely. Each meal, each kindness, became ammunition in a war of words fought not on battlefields but over tin cups of coffee. The fractures ran deep. A private from Hamburg confessed he felt safer in an American camp than in the streets of his bomb-shattered hometown. His bunkmates scoffed, accusing him of weakness. Another prisoner muttered that his family back home queued for hours for bread, while he, a captive, ate meat twice a week. That bitter comparison spread quickly, igniting shame and resentment. It was no longer just the Allies dismantling Nazi pride, it was hunger, memory, and lived contradiction. One night, a diary was passed secretly from bunk to bunk. In it, a soldier had written, "We march no longer, we argue, we carry no rifles, only questions." Here, I see democracy even in their quarrels. When guards confiscated it days later, they did not punish the writer. They returned the diary with a half smile, saying only, "Careful what you write." The irony was not lost on the men. Even forbidden words were not crushed, only noted. And so the camp became a theater of opposites. Some hardened, their pride calcifying against every gesture of goodwill. Others softened, letting questions seep into places propaganda once filled. In that tension, America's quiet victory was unfolding not through battles won abroad, but through doubt sown in the minds of those once sworn to die for Hitler. Now I turn to you. Watching this story, imagine you were there, surrounded by enemies who offered food, shelter, even respect. Would you argue until your throat was raw, clinging to a fading ideology? Or would you allow a crack of doubt to reshape everything you thought you knew? By the spring of 1946, the tide had fully turned. The war was over, Hitler was dead, and Germany lay in ruins beneath the rubble of its own ambition, one by one. The camps in America began to empty. The trains that had once carried soldiers westward in defeat now rolled eastward, taking them home to a country unrecognizable. For the prisoners, The departure was bittersweet. They left behind wooden bunks, guarded gates, and routines that had once felt like chains. Yet many also left behind something else, the first true glimpses of a different kind of life. The long rows of Detroit factories, the hum of machinery at Willow Run, the farm tables where bowls of soup had been shared, these images clung more stubbornly than barbed wire scars. One prisoner, returning to Bremen, confessed to a friend that what haunted him most was not the sound of Allied bombs, but the sight of Americans arguing freely with their guards and officers without fear. Another spoke of a nurse who had tied bandages on his frostbitten hands. A memory, he said, felt more enduring than any oath he had sworn in the Reich. And a diary, discovered years later in a family attic, contained the simple line, "We came as soldiers, we left as men again." For many, the contrast was unbearable. In Germany, they walked past hollowed-out buildings, food lines stretching for blocks, and children in threadbare coats. They remembered, with almost guilty clarity, the tables in America where bread was plentiful, where coffee was poured even for the enemy, where no one shouted slogans but instead asked about weather, crops, or baseball. The comparison burned, but it also planted seeds. Some of those men would go on to become teachers, writers, or even advocates for democratic reform in the new West Germany, carrying the paradox of their captivity like a hidden compass. America had won many victories on the battlefield, but in these quiet acts, the chair pulled out, the bowl of stew offered, the cigarette shared. It had achieved something greater. It had turned enemies into reluctant witnesses of another way of life. These were victories that could not be measured in tons of steel or numbers of aircraft, but in memories carried across oceans and decades. And so, as the last prisoners boarded their ships, the image that lingered was not of armed guards or fences, but of a table where bread was broken and silence was shared, where men once trained to kill each other sat side by side, uncertain, humbled, and human once more. That was the paradox. The quiet victory bombs could end a war, but a meal could begin a peace. Long after the camps closed and the prisoners returned to the ruins of Europe, the echoes of those unexpected meals remained. Veterans of both sides would later admit that battles blurred together in memory artillery, mud, commands shouted into chaos. But what endured were the quiet moments, the contradictions that lodged deep in the heart for German prisoners. It was not the sting of defeat that haunted them most, but the bewildering kindness of being told, "Sit down and eat, in time." Those memories became more than anecdotes. They became lessons. The sight of women welding in factories, of black workers commanding machines, of farmers sharing bread with enemies, all these details carried a moral weight far heavier than propaganda. They revealed a truth that no speech could force upon them. That dignity, once extended, reshapes even the most rigid loyalties. An old soldier later confessed that, for years after returning home, he dreamed not of gunfire but of rivet guns echoing through American hangars, each metallic clang a reminder of abundance and endurance. Another spoke of the smell of fresh bread placed before him in captivity, a smell that would always remind him of a world larger, more complicated, and more humane than the one he had once believed in. Perhaps that is the true legacy of those camps, not merely the statistics of 371,000 men held, nor the machinery they witnessed, but the fragile, enduring truth that even in war, humanity does not have to be surrendered. A rifle may win a hill, but kindness claims something deeper: memory, and perhaps even reconciliation. So, tonight, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself when history remembers, what lasts longer, the roar of guns, or the quiet invitation to share a meal?